the Gemara itself offers a possibility that everybody agrees, and there was never machlokas, that the guy could do a tmura. And according to these Rishonim, that possibility which the Gemara raises, that everybody agrees that the tmura of a guy is valid, is a case where the guy has, as we said, two things going in favor of him. Number one, he received reshus to implement a ma'aseh tmura on behalf of the Bailam HaMiskaper. Number two, he owns the animal. However, the Gemara has another tzad to say that even in this case, there's machlokas tanoim, and there are tanoim who disqualify the ma'aseh tmura of a guy, no matter what. Even though there's an element of kaparas Yisrael, but nevertheless the guy is not capable of a ma'aseh tmura, period. Yes, over him, we go back to the original machlokas tanoim, and there's no suffix about this. The machlokas tanoim is in this exact case, where the hafrasha of the guy was on behalf of kaparas habaylim, and the guy himself did the ma'aseh tmura with reshus of the Yisrael hamiskaper. That is the case of the machlokas tanoim. And the implication is that if it was not a behemas Yisrael, in the sense of kapara, meaning if the hafrasha was done by a nachri on behalf of a nachri, meaning he didn't give up kapara rights to anyone else, and he did the ma'aseh tmura, everybody would agree that that's not a valid tmura. The machlokas tanoim would be limited to a case where the guy is doing a ma'aseh tmura on behalf of Yisrael, which means that the Bailam HaMiskaper of Yisrael, and they gave reshus to the guy to do a ma'aseh tmura. Hifresh Anochri Miskaper Bo Yisrael. Again, we have the same case where the Bailam HaMiskaper was the Yisrael, and now the ma'aseh tmura was Yisrael. Nechlaku Rishonim B'davar. Here, intuitively, we would say that certainly the tmura should be valid because A, the Yisrael is the Bailam HaMiskaper, and B, the Yisrael implemented the ma'aseh tmura. But Yesh Sovrim, Shadavar Shoni B'vadai B'machlokas Tanoim, that this would be exactly the machlokas tanoim, because the Bailam here and the hafrasha was done by a guy on his own animal. And although he gave kapar rights to the Israel, and Israel then implemented a ma'aseh tmura, but nevertheless, the real choshen mishpat owner of the animal is the guy. But Yeshovim, Shelozen is Tapka Gemara. Here the Gemara had a possibility that everyone would agree that it's a valid ma'aseh tmura. Or the Gemara had another tzad to say that maybe this would depend upon a machlokas tanoim. Once again, those tanoim who would disqualify the tmura in this case, that's because the ownership of the animal is that of a goy. He says in Peiches on the bottom, L'shitas Rambam Shuva Liel Shesafek Agmar v'Meimir Nachri, and here it's the Yisrael is doing the Tmura. It's Kosa B'Kiri Sefer Yisrael HaMiskaper B'Vadai Eino Oset. So he's saying Pumpaker. It's better. It's closer to being a valid ma'aseh tmura if the guy himself does the tmura, because he's the real owner of the animal. And the Yisrael, who's a Bailam HaMiskaper, is not considered enough of a Bailam on the Behemas Akum to be able to institute a valid ma'aseh tmura. Ulachora kavanasol halacha she'eina nachri oset tmura. Achach shitas hasover shekodshim nachri oset tmura yochal Yisrael lahamer. As if the zevach itself, the behema, lends itself the Tmura, then Israel could certainly implement the Ma'aseh Tmura. Next, Hifrish HaYisrael. I think I skipped one. Hifrish HaNochri L'skaper BaNochri They Mira Yisrael B'Shus HaNochri. Here, the Ma'aseh Tmura was implemented by a Yisrael, but the Zevach is owned by a Goy. But the Yisrael, in implementing the Ma'aseh Tmura, had Rishus from the Goy. Is L'shitas HaSover, according to one opinion, She'ein Anochri Atzmo Yochel Lahamir, Gam Tmuras HaYisrael Abba Mikolcho Einu Klum. Certainly, if you hold that the Goy himself cannot implement the Ma'aseh Tmura, the Yisrael cannot be his quote-unquote shliach to implement a Ma'aseh Tmura. If, on the other hand, you hold like those Tanoim that a Goy could do a Ma'aseh Tmura, then it would seem that if he gives license to the Yisrael to operate and implement a Tmura on his behalf, it should be valid. Here, I think we should touch on the question of whether the shlichus of the akum. The parsha of shlichus is in Truma, and there it says atem, gam atem. The gam is coming to be marbe, a shliach. And the Gemara says atem gam atem is an analogy, an equation between the mishalech and the shliach. Ma atem b'nei bris af shlichach. So both the mishalech and the shliach have to be b'nei bris, have to be Jews. So to say that if a Nochri gives license to a Yisrael to be Meimer the Nochri's animal, that would be valid, that's highly questionable, because then the Yisrael should be operating on behalf of the Nochri, and there's no Shlilus to it. On the top of the left column, Mafri Hifrish Yisrael is Kaper by Yisrael, Heimer Anochim Shus Yisrael. Now we really have all the pieces, except for one, put into place. The Behema is a Zevach Shal Yisrael. The Miskaper is a Yisrael. Only problem is that the guy is going to implement the Ma'aseh Tmura. But again, he had permission to do so. He was licensed. Therefore, he should be nothing more than the Shliach of the Yisrael. His tapku b'zeh chronim chalat tmura. Again, it might be totally in the previous question about whether the shlichus was an akum, and that works in two ways. Number one, whether a guy could make a shliach. Number two, whether a guy could have a shliach. And the Minchas Chinuch is of the opinion that for sure there's no question this tmura would be valid. Because after all, Yisrael is doing the Ma'aseh Tmura, and he has riches to do so. And the Mari Korkus has the opposite conclusion, that for sure, lo chala hatmura, which means that there's no shlichus of a Yisrael for an akum. Here I'm tempted to think that a relevant concept would be what's called yada arichta. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. Let me see if I can give an example. Oh yeah, let's say in the mitzvah of market, I hire goyim, they're in my employment, I pay them a wage, and they will put up the market. So normally, a guy can't be shliach for Yisrael, but there could be a halacha called yada arichta, which means it's an extended arm. It's not really through Torah shlichus. It's not appointing a shliach and shliach also, but rather yada arichta. So maybe here in this case, since the guy gives permission to the Yisrael to be Meimir, then the Yisrael becomes Yad Arichta, becomes the extended arm of the owner of the animal, which in this case, the Nochim. Okay, I'm just going to take a minute to get some water. Sorry for that interruption. Achirish, hakotan achirish v'ashota. Don, you came a little bit late. I don't know if you have page A on the top left. Now, there's no question that a katan or a cheresh or a shota is not capable of a maisa tmura. That's because cheresh, shota, v'katan lav b'nei dayanim. They don't have das. However, there's something in Nidarim and in Kodshim which is called a katan mufla, which is samach le'ish, meaning he's in his last year, he's past the age of 12, on his way to his bar mitzvah. And if we check him out in a case where he took a neder, and we see that he knows that the neder is l'shamayim, that it's binding, so he's mature, then his neder is chal. One of the rare cases in halacha where the Torah recognizes the action of a katan. And the question is, in Tmura, where does katan mufla samach le'ish fit in? HaKatan shu mufla samach le'ish. He's already past his 12th birthday. The same thing would apply to a girl after her 11th birthday. That's called samach, meaning close to being an ish, to being bar mitzvah. Histapka Gemara tells you, again, at the beginning of Tmura, the Gemara has a suffix, it vacillates as to whether or not his Tmura is a Tmura. And we're going to have to assume that his Hakdasha is a Hakdasha. Or alternatively, maybe a Gadol could be Magdish an animal on behalf of the Katan. There's something called an Asham Shivcha Charufa. And that would apply to a katan who's 9 years old and had a relationship with a Shivcha Charufa, and he has to bring a korban. Let's say they were Magdish a korban. Now, can that same katan do a Maisa Tmura, despite the fact that he's not bar mitzvah, but he has the status of Mufla Samach Le'ish? And the Gemara vacillates back and forth. Even if I were to maintain the validity of his Maisa Tmura because he's Samach Le'ish, it doesn't mean that he gets Malchus for the Maisa Tmura, which normally you do. In fact, we even had cases where he gets multiple Malchios for Tmura. But in the case of a Katan, he still is a Katan. Even if we validate his Maisa Tmura, but as far as Onchim is concerned, to implement the Bezdin to implement Onchim, we need a God. He's got to be at least 13 years old. And this is all codified by the Rambam at the beginning of Hilchas Tmura. Yesh min achronim shestapek b'ofen shenosan hakohen rishus l'gadol lahamim. So the katan was magdish, an animal. He was samach le'ish. His neder and his hegdesh is chal. He cannot implement a Maisa Tmura, but at least let him commission another agent to operate on his behalf to do the Maisa Tmura. And the Achronim vacillate about this. Can the Gadol Osa Tmura, can he do a Maisa Tmura mikocho, because he was authorized and commissioned by the owner of the animal, in this case, the katan samach le'ish. And again, this seems to touch on the question that we've asked before. Are we dealing, when we talk about permission to do a Maisa Tmura, are we operating within the framework of shlichus, such that if Reuven gives permission to Shimon to implement a Maisa Tmura on his behalf, then Shimon becomes the shliach of Reuven. So the Maisa Tmura of Shimon relates al pi din legally to Reuven through the agency of shliach. Now, we established before that if the behemoth Kodshim is owned by a guy, and the guy commissions the Yisrael to do a Ma'aseh Tmura on his behalf, it's not a valid Ma'aseh Tmura. So we see that l'chor we're operating within the framework of shlichus. And therefore, if the owner of the animal is a muflas samach leish, he's only 12 years old, he's not bar mitzvah, he doesn't have a shliach, according to the halacha. He cannot appoint someone on his behalf to do a Ma'aseh Tmura, because atan gamat, you need a bardas. Therefore, clearly, in this case, there would be no possibility of a Ma'aseh Tmura, even though he had permission to do so. So I'm thinking out loud that maybe shlichus could operate in this case. Even though atem gam atem restricts and limits shlichus to the case of a ardas, but nevertheless, once his halacha in this particular area of halacha, vis-a-vis nedarim and hekdeshos, is halacha of muflas samach leish, and we recognize his ability, even though he's only 12, to generate kedushas carbon and zevach. Maybe in that context, he can make a shliach. We can recognize his valid status of appointing a shliach to do the Ma'aseh Tmura on his behalf. However, I think we should reject that. And I'll tell you why. We have a rule in shlichus that if you cannot do the action yourself, you cannot appoint a shliach. If it's ain't a kosher bo, then the mela ain't no kosher b'shliach. So since in this case the katan, even though he's muflas samach leish, is not capable of implementing a Ma'aseh Tmura that's valid, he cannot appoint and commission someone else who's a gadol to implement a Ma'aseh Tmura on his behalf. Yesh min achronim shetzidei shacherish v'ashote tmurasan tmura. This is a pella. That if a katan cannot create tmura, Ma'aseh Tmura, but a cherish and a shota can create a valid Ma'aseh Tmura. If he says anything in the footnote, because otherwise, Tzadi Dalid. All right, that doesn't really help me much. Olas Shlom. Oh, wait a minute. So the Acharat Tmura Chala Af Betos, or Ein Tzot Das Kitmur Vakotan Ismait Mishum Shenever Posuk Each Ki Yaf Kotanenu Each. Wow. Oh, this is fascinating. Basically, Cherish Shot V'Katan, all three of them should be able to implement a Ma'aseh Tmura. And the reason for that is because you don't need Das for Tmura. There's a separate miyud of Katan that excludes Katan from a Ma'aseh Tmura because it says each Kiyafu. Ish below katan. But if not for that mute of ish, you would not exclude neither a cherish nor a katan because you don't need das for tmura. And in the cases of cherish v'shota, where there is no mute, then there is tmura. So let's amplify this in the light of the next paragraph. Atmura chala af betos, meaning you don't need das for tmura. You made a mistake, and yet the tmura is valid. What does that mean? Eitzad Hoylo shtei karbanos, achashal ola v'achashal shlomim, v'ratzel lahamir be'emas ola. He wanted to do a Maisa Tmura on his Behemas Olav, a tub, a Maisa Tmura, Vyomar Tmuras, Shlomim. So basically, he has three animals in front of him. He's got an Ola, a Shlomim, and a Behemas Chulin. And he points to the Behemas Chulin and he says, Harezu Tmurat Shlomim. But what he really meant to say was Harezu Tmurat Ola. And that's what you call a Tmura B'tos. And halacha is that this tmura is a valid ma'aseh tmura, which means that the behemas kulin, enochinami, receives the status of a behemas shlamim, even though he had in mind to say harezu chalufa tmuras behemas ola. But once the words came out of his mouth, then it's valid, it's binding. We see that Tos does not undermine a Maisa Tmura. It reminds a little bit of Yibum because we're learning Masech Yivamas. And in Yivamas, we have a halacha that Tos does not undermine the Maisa Yibum. As long as he has kavanah for Maisa Bia, even if he mistakenly was under the impression that through the Maisa Bia he's divorcing her, it would still be a valid Yibum and she's an HSC Shkura. You don't need das for Yibum. We said that a katan in Yibum is only derabbanan, like a maimer, status of a maimer. So it could be that Yibum, although it doesn't need das, even at Tos, but you need someone who's a bar ishus, that he can make a woman into each toe, each is each. And a cotton can't have ishus. But in the case of Tmura, cotton could have Tmura. And if Tmura doesn't require das, and that we saw from the case of Tos, then you don't even need a bar das to effectuate Tmura. But the separate halacha of ish, that doesn't apply to a chayrit. You know, I have a feeling that the whole suffix here revolves around the question of whether or not the pasuk ish excludes not only katan but also chayrit shota. That chayrit shota have the same status as a katan. They're just three, chayrit shota and katan, just three permutations of lav bar das, that they're excluded mufka from being a bar das. Once the Torah says ish and it excludes katan, Mimela, I know that it excludes cherish and shota. Make a note of where we got up to.